Thank you. Have a seat, Nico. Great. We're delighted to be joined by our friend and colleague, Haoliang Xu, as you know, is an assistant administrator in the UN Development Program, who's just returned from Gaza and the West Bank, and he wanted to brief you. So, Haoliang, please, you have the floor, and then we'll take some questions.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for this opportunity, Stefan. Maybe just a couple of points to start. And as we know, since the Hamas's horrendous attacks in Israel on October 7th last year, we have had a series, challenges, right, in terms of the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Right? And the UN, including UNDP colleagues, have been working throughout this period of time to support the humanitarian response. So my trip is really to demonstrate our leadership support to our colleagues, who are working there, but also to understand the humanitarian situation and see what more we can do to provide their support. I think it is very clear that we needed to have a ceasefire as soon as possible. We needed to see the immediate release of hostages. Right? We needed to work with all sides to achieve a ceasefire. And then we needed to have a political solution to the long-running conflict so that we can possibly move to the phase of recovery and reconstruction. I think you have been briefed every day about the humanitarian needs in Gaza. And if you want statistics, the UN can give you a lot. I can also mention some of this. But what I've seen is quite challenging. I have been to many conflicts and post-disaster situations or disasters themselves that I experienced. I can say that I've never seen the kind of devastation that I've seen in Gaza, in my career. If you recall, there have been a lot of assessments, right, from different UN agencies, UNDP, UNESCO, UN Office of Outer Space, Activities, and so forth. The World Bank UN joint assessment earlier this year already put the damage to infrastructure at $18.9 billion. So almost 1 year on, you can imagine the amount of damage, right? And the different estimates say that there's 40 to 50 million tons of debris that the war has caused, right? In terms of humanitarian situations, very quickly, in terms of food, right? And we know that half of the people who depend on WFP food assistance has not been able to receive this for the last 3 months, right? Estimates say that 1.8 million people are in phase 3 of the IPC, food security, rank, right? And what I know is that at least for the last month, no fresh fruit and vegetables have been imported, right? So in terms of this food, situation, right? One is the question of hunger, right? But what I saw is also the impact on children, right? Because the children are not getting the nutrients, right? The protein and the vitamins that are necessary for their growth, right? So it is a generational issue, right? This is creating, the humanitarian crisis is creating. In terms of hospitals, healthcare, right? We know there has been quite extensive damages to the healthcare facilities. I visited one hospital, the Nasser Hospital in Han Yunis, which has become the largest operating hospitals, public hospitals in Gaza, right? But there are severe shortages of medicine and also, blood for transfusion, right? This is what I saw, right? I was in emergency rooms. The conditions are really challenging. There are, quite a few field hospitals that different countries have set up. But based on my discussions with healthcare providers, many of these hospitals still rely, in fact, on public hospitals to provide the critical capacity to operate. Right? So there are really quite serious challenges in this regard. Then, in terms of education, right? And obviously, we have a generation of children, who cannot, have the opportunity of regular, education, right? And there are a lot of challenges, right? So I think you are familiar with this. Now, maybe one word on what UNDP is doing, right, in such a humanitarian, crisis situation. I think, as I said earlier, we need a release of hostages. We need a ceasefire, right, which will create conditions for scaling up of humanitarian assistance, which is really necessary, right, to save lives. And UNDP is part of the UN country team's humanitarian response, right? Because what we're trying to do is to incorporate development principles, right, in humanitarian response activities that will meet the immediate needs of humanitarian assistance, but also lays the foundations for early recovery. That's what we try to achieve, right? I'll give you some examples of what we do as part of the humanitarian actions. Early on, one activity we tried to implement is to use solar-powered water desalination stations to provide drinking water to people who have lost their homes and are in camps. Right? So we have 7 units operating. For example, each unit is producing about, let's say, 20 to 25 cubic meters of water every day. And for humanitarian response standards, you need 6 liters of drinking water per person per day, right? So this capacity allows us to provide, to meet the needs of about 300,000 people a day, right? Not a lot, but it's critical, right? So we have additional units in pipeline, right? And we aim to provide drinking water for 600,000 people, right? Now, obviously, to make this happen, we needed to coordinate with Israeli authorities very closely for importation of this, equipment, right? So this is one example what we're doing. Now, another example of our work is in waste management, solid waste management. And the destruction of houses, right, extensive destruction of houses is putting 2.1 million people, right, on the move, right, multiple times. And there are different statistics. So essentially, let's say close to 2 million people are living in either, makeshift tents or in partially damaged houses, right? And they also create, hundreds of tons of daily, solid waste next to their camps, right? I visited many such dump sites. And the smell in these dump sites, right, are really intolerable, you can say, right? Now, if this issue is not dealt with, it will really, exacerbate the health crisis that we're already experiencing, right? You stand to have public health outbreaks as a result of this, right? So, in coordination with the local municipal councils, for example, right? Of course, also, coordinating with the Israeli authorities, right, for importation of necessary equipment. In November, for example, we have moved, I think, more than 200,000 tons of solid waste from these dump sites, unmanaged dump sites, to managed temporary dump sites, right? So that create better conditions, for the population, right, that is already living in very challenging situations, right? So this is not traditional humanitarian assistance, you can say, but this really is critical for the overall humanitarian situation in Gaza, right? Another example I can mention, and then I will stop. We have many more examples of what we do that are critical, I would think, is the emergency employment opportunities that we're providing in different sectors. I mentioned the Nasser hospital earlier. The hospital has 1,100 staff at this time. but they are short of capacity, right, based on the needs. And also a lot of their specialty doctors also are part of the population, part of the statistics, right, that have lost their lives or been injured, right. So there's a critical gap in many fields. So what we do under our, of course, our donor-funded employment scheme, emergency employment scheme, is to provide the critical capacity to fill the gaps. So we're providing in this hospital, for example, 70 doctors and nurses, right, to help the hospital to be operational, right. As I said, this is the largest public hospital at this time in Gaza, right, after Shifa Hospital, and so. Overall, we're providing about 3,000, such emergency jobs, right, to different sectors, including private sector, to help them, recover even during crisis, to produce the food, the food items that can still be sold, right, can be sourced from local market, so create some opportunities for young people and for also private entrepreneurs. And these are some examples, right, that we're doing to just tell you, to give you an impression why we're there, what we're doing, right. Now, perhaps the last point I will mention, I will stop, okay, is that we really needed to have a ceasefire as soon as possible, right, in order to talk about recovery, and that recovery has to have an approach that is whole of Palestine. Because the economy of occupied territory, Palestinian territory is affected as a whole, not only in Gaza. Right? For example, in West Bank itself, right, statistics show that more than 300,000 jobs has been lost as a result of this recent conflict. Right? And in fact, the West Bank can produce a lot of supplies of food, dairy products, and other items that are critically needed for humanitarian response in Gaza, but also for early recovery in Gaza. Right? So the recovery of Gaza, right, and the recovery of West Bank, right, is really closely linked. Right? And in West Bank, right, I met also Palestinian officials, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Planning and the International Cooperation, and the other senior officials, right. Right. The messages are very clear from senior officials. Right. They don't condone the Hamas attacks on October 7th. They condemn it publicly in public meetings that are attended, right, with donors, with other partners. Right. They call for an immediate ceasefire. But they also call for the dignified treatment of all Palestinians, right? The rights of Palestinians, right, to self-determination that Secretary General, has repeated, right? And there's also an effort in the Palestinian Authority to undertake reforms that will help bring Palestinian unity together, right? For the time when, there's a ceasefire and then there's a political solution. So a lot is happening. And the UNDP, as you know, has a program of assistance to the Palestinian people that was also created by the General Assembly in 1978. We set up our Ramallah office in the West Bank, right? In 1983, I believe, right? We set up our Gaza office in 1989. So we have 45 years of experience, right? Building capacity, building institutions, building infrastructure, supporting communities, right? And so we want to make sure that early recovery, which is approved by the UN country team, right, is a part of the humanitarian action, that we sow the seeds, for early recovery while we're in the humanitarian phase, right? Maybe I will stop here for now, and happy to answer some questions.
Thank you. Ibtisam?
Thank you. My name is Ibtisam Azim, Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper. If you could tell us also about the financial needs that you, for your fund, like if there is more money that you need, if you are getting enough support. And then regarding Gaza and the issues whether goods or different materials that you are not allowed to get there. If you could elaborate a little bit when it comes to hospitals, but also to education. I saw some reports talking about that the Israelis are not allowing pencils and notebooks. Is that true? And could you say more to that? And then on the West Bank, how much is the settlers' attacks that are supported by the Israeli army also influence the issue of agriculture and economic situation? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Should I answer? Okay. No, thank you for this question. And in terms of financial needs, I think we can double, triple, quadruple our response if we had more resources, certainly, right? Because the whole of humanitarian assistance does not have sufficient resources, right, for responding. So the short answer is yes. For employment, for urgent employment generation, we have 3,000. We can make the 10,000 tomorrow if we had more resources, right? So donors are providing resources, right? One example I can cite is that in the West Bank, in one of the public, ceremonies that the Prime Minister and the Minister of Planning and the Minister of Social, Development attended, we signed an agreement, UNDP, with UNRWA and with the German government, right, with Palestinian Authority, an agreement for 25 million euros to create 8,000 jobs over the next 3 years for Palestinian youth, right? So this is a very concrete example of what we can do if we had more resources, right? We can help build the resilience, build the so-called agency of young people, right, during a time of crisis. So we can do a lot of this. Okay. Now, in terms of importation, clearly we needed to work very closely with Israeli authorities, for importation of goods and supplies, right? I mentioned the water supply systems earlier, right? So this was the units that we identified very quickly, after outbreak of the current, conflict in local markets. But we have had very productive discussions with Israeli authorities, and I understand that we have the permit to import additional units, right, for additional water provision of additional drinking water, right, with similar systems. So this is very positive. In terms of, for example, the waste management, right, you need containers, right, to manage this, right, because but the containers are built by metals, right, which is can be considered as dual use, right. So we have had a lot of advocacy at senior level, right. You mentioned Sigrid Kaag, right, and we definitely use our contacts at all levels, right, to advocate, for import of this kind of, materials that are necessary. Right? So we, in the first phase, we obtained a permit to import 15, such, containers, right, that were distributed in different sites, collection sites, that are being used at this time. I think recently, during my visit, we obtained additional permit, right, to import additional units of metal containers, right, for waste management. So these dialogues are ongoing, okay. And then, the housing is an enormous challenge at this time because winter is setting in, right. And also, the hospitals need additional bed capacity, right, the additional beds, right, for emergency response and so forth. So we have had discussions, productive discussions with Israeli authorities as a proof of concept, right, to import 140 or so prefabs, right, for different uses, right, for hospitals, for local, governance institutions, right, because if you want local joint, councils to work, for example, for waste management or for certain decisions that affect service delivery, right, as much as you can, you need to recover this kind of capacity for convening, right, and so forth. So we have good discussions on this and other issues. So we have a lot of discussions. Not all our requests are agreed to, but we wanted to keep open, transparent, and constructive dialogue, because our interest is to really make sure that we work together to improve the lives of Palestinian people in Gaza, right, and also in West Bank, under very, very difficult circumstances. So this is what I can say to this.
But it's not allowed
Yeah, okay.
to...
No, I think, no, I have not, of course, we didn't get into discussion into a lot of details. I met Israeli officials during my visit as well in West Jerusalem. My understanding is that the Israeli authorities is open to discuss a permit for goods that they consider humanitarian, right? So my impression, I've not discussed this directly with them, is that, because I was not involved in many of these issues, right, is that if they consider certain type of goods that are not immediately needed for humanitarian assistance, they may reject it, right? So that's my understanding of their principle, So, but I'm happy to really work with our colleagues further to understand, the specifics that you mentioned. Now, for education, for example, what I can mention again is that, education. If you talk about humanitarian, if you talk about education under humanitarian circumstances, you think of UNICEF, obviously, right? UNESCO, and of course, the UNRWA, right? And other, other actors. Many NGOs are providing that, right? And what we tried to do, okay, is not to get into education sector per se, but we see education as an entry point to do a lot of other things. That while providing education possibilities for humanitarian response, we also involve the private sector in the process. Because at this time, education can only take place in makeshift tents, right? But for this makeshift tents, you need the furniture, you need a blackboard, right? You need the teachers, or you need some other equipment. So what we are doing is, again, the proof of concept is to involve local entrepreneurs to build furnitures with locally available materials, right? And to find teachers that are available locally, and through the emergency employment scheme, to give them some support, right? So that's what we do, right? So we have demonstrated, we have built a number of a number of makeshift schools where we source the furniture from locally made, local materials made by entrepreneurs that are still operating in Gaza. Our capacity, is to support probably 1,000, places for students. It's not enough, but as a proof of concept, right, we can do that. We have done that. And we're working with UNICEF colleagues, right, to scale this up with the humanitarian funding resource that they have access to. So we're doing this. The supply issue, I'm sure, will come up as we get into this further. Thank you.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you for this information. Inam Tahan from Associate Press. The question is, are you willing to, the UN is willing to help these people moving or shifting their areas to different where they will be away from those diseases or dumpsters, so they can, they can prevent them from having additional health issues? That's one. And the second question is, the neighboring countries, are they welcoming any of those injured that need immediate attention? Did you deal with any of those neighboring countries? Thank you.
Okay. So, one thing that I realized from my visit, okay, is how small Gaza Strip is, okay. Because when you look at maps, okay, when you listen to briefings before I visited, you hear many names of cities, right? From Ramallah, you enter, you go to Han Yunis, you go to Deir al-Balah, and then further on, right? You go to north of Gaza. Okay, but when you go there, I realize that how close they are. They are very small places. Okay, and then we're talking about close to 2 million people, really limited to a very small space, right? And there's really no place to move anybody, other than where they are at this time. I can tell you, right? So it's challenging situation, right? Because the Gaza Strip by the coastal area and so forth, right? Everywhere that's empty almost, right? You have makeshift tents. They're not solid, high-quality tents, right? They're literally makeshift tents, right? That I saw. Okay? So it's a really challenging situation, right? And also the damage to housing is extensive, right? But there's still a lot of people who rather live in partially damaged housing, right, than living in tents, right? So one thing we're doing is to try to provide some dignified solution to temporary housing, right? So I visited some of these project sites that we're supporting, right? And we can do more if we had more funding, obviously, right? But these are not long-term solutions. But what we're talking about is to help them perhaps go through winter in somewhat better conditions. Many partially destroyed houses, for example, doesn't have a window, right? So we can provide a window of some kind, right, with plastic sheeting, so that there's some insulation, right? So this is the kind of activities we're doing. So you cannot really move people anyways. What we can do is to move the trash, right, the solid waste, away from these stations, because they cannot be moved again, right? They've been moved a number of times, So there's about 140 or so temporary dump sites that are being, let's say, used, okay, to move this solid waste to, right? But ultimately, you also need to deal with this. Now, I mentioned the debris clearance, right? There's anywhere between 50 million cubic meters of solid waste, right? And we cannot really move them now, right? It's not possible. You have to really have a plan, right? But what we try to focus on is on debris that block public access, that are critical for humanitarian assistance, for example, right? This is what we can do now, right? Our next priority, if there's more funding, for example, right, we can focus on public buildings, because when it comes to private properties, there are a lot of issues, property rights, and a lot of issues, right? So we're not talking about this now, right? But for removal of debris, then you need to think about the future use, right? How can you use recycle some of the materials for reconstruction, right? You need a lot of equipment, right? You need weighing stations, for example, right? That will involve a lot of potentially dual-use materials, right? How do you deal with this, right? So there are a lot of questions we're not there yet, right? But we're working on this now. We have from local market, we've sourced, for the weighing stations that we can actually properly, weigh the materials, sort the materials, and and then store them for potential future use, right? We're also working with UNDP, about environmental impact and so forth, right? Now, on your second question, very quickly on medical evacuation, WHO is dealing with this. There has been different episodes of evacuations, right? But it's not at the level that's needed, right? The people who are on the waiting list, who are qualified for that, is quite significant. Thank you.
Thank you. And I see no more questions. Haoliang, thank you very much. And we hope to see you back here soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very
Take
much.
care.
Appreciate it. Yeah, okay. Keep in touch.